Let's take a look at our island. Here the island represents the United States private sector. So we have private individuals and government and the Federal Reserve. We'll just call that all one. I know the libertarians will be upset by that, saying that the Federal Reserve is a private organization, which is partially true. It's not completely true. The Federal Reserve is a central bank, does function as an arm of the government. It is the government's bank. So it's really just a lot easier to think about the government and the Federal Reserve as one in terms of how money is brought into the economy. The actual interactions between the government, the U.S. Treasury, and the Federal Reserve are complex. And there's a lot of self-imposed rules governing how they interact. But the Fed operates at the discretion of Congress. The Congress created the Federal Reserve. Everything that the Federal Reserve does, it does on behalf of the government. It is part of the government. So anyway, in terms of this conversation, that's the way we're going to think about it. So let's start with our island. As of now, nobody's got any money. The government comes in and it wants to introduce money to the economy, and it wants to provision stuff for itself. But let's just say for now that it wants to create a road across the island. So it's going to create a road. It's going to ask Fred, Wilma, and Betty to build this road, and they do. So they build a road, and it's got landscaping and all that stuff. It's got a little dock coming out of it, And in the process, the federal government created dollars to pay for this road. And in the end, Fred ended up with 100, Wilma ended up with 100, and Betty ended up with 100. This is the money that was created. Federal government and the Federal Reserve have the exclusive right to create money. They print money, they mint coins, and they create what is called high-powered money. Now, they do operate through the commercial bank system, and they regulate the commercial bank system. So banks need to maintain accounts with the Reserve. So they have money in an account at the Fed. So it's like their bank as well. And there are rules governing how much they have in reserve at the Federal Reserve based on how much money they have on deposit and in checking accounts. The rules are actually complicated, but they're kind of beside the point. In this case, the government spent money into the economy by requisitioning this road from people, and it credited their checking accounts in the banking system. Of course, the banks get like printed bills and coins and whatnot from the government and the Federal Reserve. We're just going to call it the government, but it's both. So now that we have money in the economy, let's say that this economy is now working at full production, that Fred is working full-time, and Wilma is working full-time, and Betty is working full-time. And $100 each, on average, tends to be what they need to live and function. So this money is not their wealth. The real wealth is what they do. When Fred spends $5 to get a hammock from Wilma, hammock, and the hammock's going that way. The hammock is what is the real value. The $5 is just a means of exchange. And so everyone working at full time, money is basically just moving around. And when Betty spends $5, that's $5 spent, but that's income for Fred. So Fred spending $5 is $5 income for Wilma. She spends $5. That's income for Betty. Betty spends $5. That's income for Fred. And in the process, there's goods and services being created. So what is happening is that we've got all these people and the resources that they are resources with their labor and their talent, but also the resources that they control in terms of things that they can turn into goods. That's the real wealth of the country. And when everyone is working full time, the entire population is working full time, that's when the country, or in this case the island, but the country is working at full capacity. And that's the optimum. So If now the government were to say, like, we're going to pull money out, we're going to tax everyone, we're going to take out, say, $50 each, so that Fred now only has 50, and Wilma only has 50, and Betty only has 50. Well, they still have the same amount of capacity in terms of their production, but now there is less money in the system. So classic economics would predict that this would be deflationary, that the result would eventually be that all the same goods and services would simply have lower prices. That's called deflation. So taking money out of the supply so people have less money to use is deflationary. However, in real life, people don't like having their income cut. That Wilma doesn't want to sell her hammock for $2.50 instead of for $5. And so in general, when the money supply is cut, in reality, what happens is there is unemployment. People work less. So Fred may cut back how much he's producing, and Wilma may cut back how much she's producing, and she'll be spending less, and Betty be spending less. And so they are not operating at full capacity. While in some ways it seems like it's good that the government is trying to balance its budget, because when it created the $300 originally, that was a deficit, and now it wants to pay down its debt and run a surplus. So in this case, this year, it took in $150, 50-50-50, and was running a surplus. Maybe that sounds good for the government, but that is not good for the economy, because there's now not enough money to make the economy run efficiently. And there is a psychological factor. Yes, I mean, if everyone was perfectly rational, then everyone would say, oh, well, I'll just, everything is just going to be half price of what it used to be. And everyone could still work at full production. But that's not what happens. That there's a psychological factor. People get sticky wages. You get down to a point where people won't accept any lower wages in exchange for their labor or goods. They won't sell for any lower price. And so they're going to sell less and they're going to work less. There's going to be unemployment. So in this case, originally, the first year one, year two. So year one, we ran a deficit, and that gave all the money that this country needed to run at full productivity. Year two, the government ran a surplus and took half the money that existed out of the private economy to pay down its quote-unquote debt, and now there's not enough money to keep the economy running at full production. So the word surplus and deficit are neutral. There are cases where running a deficit is good. When is it good? If the economy is not running at full production, if there is unemployment, if there's not enough money in circulation to keep everyone working and producing at full production, then you want the government to run a deficit. Of course, how it runs a deficit is another question. Currently, the way it does it is not very good, not efficient. But nonetheless, you want to get more money into the system to bring it back up to full production. So you know that the country should be running a deficit when there's unemployment, because that tells you we're not at full production. You want the country to run a surplus. That is, you want it to pull money out of the system if there's inflation. So let's go the other way. Suppose in year three, the government adds $150 to everyone. So buys goods and services worth that much. Now everyone has $200. Now, a number of things could happen. One, the government is now competing for people's labor with the private sector. And so we get to absolute full capacity, and much of it is being used by the government for whatever their project they're doing or whatever they're buying. But in the end, if we need $100 each for the economy to be running at full capacity, putting in an extra 100 per person is going to tend to be inflationary. Rather than spending $5 for a hammock, Wilma will demand 10. And so there's going to be an inflationary spiral. So when you have inflation, that's a time when you want to pull money out of the system because there's excess money in the system when it's at full capacity. So when everyone is working full bore and producing all the real goods and services, the real wealth of the country, but the prices are going up, that's when you know there's too much money in the system, and the government should tax some of it out or take it out by some other mean, which you can do by selling treasuries and so on. So that's basically the idea of when government spending is inflationary and when it is deflationary. Now, keep in mind that the government created this money initially, and anytime it creates money out of nothing, it just says, here's money. It just, with keystrokes, it credits people's checking accounts. It doesn't have to get it from anywhere. There's no pile of gold anywhere. It creates it as it needs it. The key is, how is the amount of money that the government is spending into the private sector, how is that affecting the well-being of everyone? And the real measure is, are we at full employment and full production capacity? That's the measure. If we're not at full production capacity, if we're not at full employment such that no one is involuntarily unemployed, then the government needs to spend more money into the private sector. If, on the other hand, we are at full production, everyone is working full bore, and we are producing the maximum amount of goods and services that we can, and prices are rising, at that point, that's when the government wants to pull money out.